Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read-along of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We are reading our way through the book with copious commentary, and we are halfway done. We're on Chapter 30. And Chapter 30 finds us right where we left off. A small party has left from the Longbourn area. Sir William Lucas and his daughter Maria, plus Elizabeth Bennet, have left town, traveled a little bit to the next county over, to Hunsford parsonage, to see Sir William's daughter, Charlotte Lucas, who has married Mr. Collins, who is the heir to the Longbourn estate. They went because she implored them to. You have to imagine how lonely she is in a country full of strangers, away from home for the first time, as a wife for the first time, obviously, any kind of intimacy with men. She implores them to come, and so her family and her former best friend, Elizabeth Bennet, do go. And Elizabeth, at least, is motivated by the same thing that we as readers are feeling, which is a curiosity to see how Charlotte Lucas is doing. We know the horrible, unfeeling bargain that she made. She knows perfectly well what a fool Mr. Collins is, but she wants the security of an establishment. She wants the security of a house, an income, better prospects ahead, because, of course, when Mr. Collins inherits Longbourn, she will inherit it as well. We're curious to see how things are going with her. And to my eyes, Jane Austen doesn't portray it as an absolute nightmare, but to my eyes, it certainly seems like one. And that's where things are left. The highlight of the last chapter was that Elizabeth Bennet finally met the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, the powerful, wealthy patroness of Mr. Collins, who he can't shut up about, and who happens to be the aunt of Mr. Darcy, in whom she sees a great many similarities. So when she sees those similarities in Lady Catherine in the last chapter, we continue with the thread that we have noticed, how even when Darcy's not in a chapter, he still manages to be a presence in that chapter. He's constantly in the narrative. He's never far away. And in this next chapter, Jane Austen makes that even more direct. So this is chapter 30. Sir William stayed only a week at Hunsford, but his visit was long enough to convince him of his daughter's being most comfortably settled, and of her possessing such a husband and such a neighbor as were not often met with. If he doesn't want to see it, he won't. She's certainly not going to say to him, "Papa, I made a mistake." That's not even possible for her to say. While Sir William was with them, Mr. Collins devoted his mornings to driving him out in his gig and showing him the country. But when he went away, the whole family returned to their usual employments, and Elizabeth was thankful to find that they did not see more of her cousin by the alteration, for the chief of the time between breakfast and dinner were now passed by him either in the work in the garden, or in reading and writing, or looking out of the window of his own book room, which fronted the road. So apparently, like Mr. Bennet, he has a library on which he closes the door to other people. The room in which the lady sat was backwards. Elizabeth at first had rather wondered that Charlotte should not prefer the dining parlor for common use. It was a better-sized room and had a pleasanter aspect. But she soon saw that her friend had an excellent reason for what she did, for Mr. Collins would undoubtedly have been much less in his own apartment had they sat in one equally lively, and she gave Charlotte credit for the arrangement. Some credit, pretty bleak credit. Charlotte has chosen this back room at Hunsford parsonage specifically because it's not attractive to Mr. Collins. He's less likely to want to show up there. From the drawing room they could distinguish nothing in the lane, and were indebted to Mr. Collins for his knowledge of what carriages went along, and how often especially Miss de Bourgh drove by in her phaeton, which she never failed coming to inform them of, though it happened almost every day. She not infrequently stopped at the parsonage and had a few minutes' conversation with Charlotte, but was scarcely ever prevailed on to get out of her little carriage. Very few days passed in which Mr. Collins did not walk to Rosings, which is the Lady Catherine de Bourgh's home, just across the way. They're next-door neighbors. And not many in which his wife did not think it necessary to go likewise. Until Elizabeth recollected that there might be other family livings to be disposed of, she could not understand the sacrifice of so many hours. So Hunsford Parsonage is fairly small. It's a fairly modest place, a couple of fields, some small rooms, a small house, small garden. But here we learn that the Lady Catherine de Bourgh might have other livings to bestow. There's nothing that says that Mr. Collins can't have 10 of them and become very wealthy. Now and then they were honored with a call from her ladyship, and nothing escaped her observation that was passing in the room during these visits. She examined into their employments, looked at their work, and advised them to do it differently, found fault with the arrangements of the furniture or detected the housemaid in negligence, and if she accepted any refreshment, seemed to do it only for the sake of finding out that Mrs. Collins's joints of meat were too large for her family. Elizabeth soon perceived that though this great lady was not in the commission of the peace for the county, she was a most active magistrate in her own parish, the minutest concerns of which were carried to her by Mr. Collins, and whenever any of the cottagers were disposed to be quarrelsome, discontented, or too poor, she sallied forth into the village to settle their differences, silence their complaints, and scold them into harmony and plenty. So Mr. Collins is the parson here, but we now know that the whole place is run by the Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The entertainment of dining at Rosings was repeated about twice a week, and allowing for the loss of Sir William, there being only one card table in the evening, every such entertainment was the counterpart of the first. Their other engagements were very few, as the style of living in the neighbourhood in general was beyond the Collinses' reach. This, however, was no evil to Elizabeth, and upon the whole she spent her time comfortably enough. There were half hours of pleasant conversation with Charlotte, and the weather was so fine for the time of year that she often had the great enjoyment of the outdoors. Her favourite walk, and where she frequently went while the others were calling on Lady Catherine, was along the open grove which edged that side of the park, where there was a nice sheltered path which no one seemed to value but herself, and where she felt beyond the reach of Lady Catherine's curiosity. I wonder what Lady Catherine thinks of this. What did Lady Catherine think the first time the party from Hunsford came over and Elizabeth wasn't there, just because she didn't feel like going? Has that ever happened to Lady Catherine before? I wonder that we don't get that reaction. In this quiet way, the first fortnight of her visit soon passed away. Easter was approaching, and the week preceding it was to bring an addition to the family at Rosings, which in so small a circle must be important. Elizabeth had heard soon after her arrival that Mr. Darcy was expected there in the course of a few weeks, and though there were not many of her acquaintance whom she did not prefer, his coming would furnish one comparatively new look at in their Rosings parties, and she might be amused in seeing how hopeless Miss Bingley's designs on him were by his behaviour to his cousin, for whom he was evidently destined by Lady Catherine, who talked of his coming with the greatest satisfaction, spoke of him in terms of the highest admiration, and seemed almost angry to find that he had already been frequently seen by Miss Lucas and herself. They're familiar with Mr. Darcy, so she doesn't get to lord it over them for introducing them or making him known to them. Mr. Darcy is going to arrive in person in the book. His arrival was soon known at the parsonage, for Mr. Collins was walking the whole morning within view of the lodges opening into Hunsford Lane, and in order to have the earliest assurance of it, and after making his bow as the carriage turned into the park, hurried home with the great intelligence. On the following morning he hastened to Rosings to pay his respects. There were 2 nephews of Lady Catherine to require them, for Mr. Darcy had brought with him a Colonel Fitzwilliam, the younger son of his uncle Lord Donahue. And to great surprise of all the party, when Mr. Collins returned, the gentleman accompanied him. Charlotte had seen them from her husband's room, crossing the road, and immediately running to the others, told the girls what an honour they might expect, adding, "I may thank you, Eliza, for this piece of civility. Mr. Darcy would never come so soon to wait upon me." A hint here, one of a couple that we've had so far, that in addition to the fact that all of Meryton was aware of the fact that Jane and Mr. Bingley were in love with each other, were taken with each other, it's also just possible that everybody noticed the sparks flying between Elizabeth and Darcy. Elizabeth had scarcely time to disclaim all right to the compliment before their approach was announced by the doorbell, and shortly afterwards the 3 gentlemen entered the room. Colonel Fitzwilliam, who led the way, was about 30, not handsome, but in person and address most truly a gentleman. Mr. Darcy looked just as he had used to look at Hertfordshire, paid his compliments, and with his usual reserve, to Mrs. Collins, and whatever might be his feelings towards her friend, met her with every appearance of composure. Elizabeth merely curtsied to him without saying a word. Colonel Fitzwilliam entered into conversation directly with the readiness and ease of a well-bred man, and talked very pleasantly. But his cousin, after having addressed a slight observation on the house and garden to Mrs. Collins, sat for some time without speaking to anybody. At length, however, his civility was so far awakened as to inquire of Elizabeth after the health of her family. She answered him in the usual way, and after a moment's pause, added, "My eldest sister has been in town these 3 months. Have you never happened to see her there?" Uh, it's been a open question, a subject. Is the Bingley party, are they keeping him away from Jane? Is Darcy maybe keeping him away from Jane? Do they must know that Jane is in town. Uh, she was perfectly sensible that he never had seen her sister, in other words, but she wished to see whether he would betray any consciousness of what had passed between the Bingleys and Jane. And she thought he looked a little confused as he answered that he had never been so fortunate as to meet Miss Bennet. The subject was pursued no farther, and the gentleman soon afterwards went away. And that is chapter 30, which is pretty short, pretty to the point. Darcy is at Rosings for a little while. He is visiting. So he and Elizabeth are now next door neighbors. But when he comes over, he's the same old Darcy. He barely speaks at all. We're not told in this chapter that he can't take his eyes off her, but I'd be willing to read into the lines and say that he can't. So what happens next? All of a sudden, this placid visit has been turned combustible. What will happen next time? We'll wrap this up for now, and we'll find out together. Thank you, BookTube.